Good day. Today is November 9th, 2019. And I'm going to try to make 3 videos this morning that came to me this morning as I was waking up from some dreams. And this one is I'm going to do it, it's a part 2, the last one of the 3. And I'm going to use the gasoline engine as an example. You look at a concept and or some operations, something that's happening, but you look at it as a whole unit, as complete as you can, being knowledgeable about it. So, to move on here, how a gasoline engine operates to move an object, such as a automobile, a truck, or tractor, something like that. Now, the gasoline engine is basically a combustion, an explosion that is contained. And this explosion is contained in such a way that it pushes a piston, which is connected to a connecting rod, which is connected to a crankshaft, which through transmission is connected to an axle with a wheel on it, and with a rubber tire on that wheel, where the rubber tire gives it more friction so that it doesn't sit there and slide if it was a steel tire, like on a railroad train, a steam engine. A steam engine is the same thing. It's an explosion that's contained and pushes that piston, but it's operating under a fire making steam, and that steam expands and pushes that piston, where a gasoline engine is ignited by the spark plug and it's an explosion. Okay, now this is an example of how not to do something. In the 60s, the 1960s, they started to look at the gases that were coming off this gasoline engine, that were coming out of the exhaust pipe, that were coming out of the exhaust valve from the explosion in the self-contained container. And they said, oh, this has got obnoxious gases in it, and we need to start filtering some of this stuff out. And so they were just looking at one part of this, the gases coming off. Whereas back in the 1920s, intelligent people were looking at what happens in the combustion. And they realized, because they were more intelligent than these people today that are looking just at the off gases to clean them up, they looked at the combustion, which was the carburation and the combustion chamber and all that. And they realized that if you had a more thorough, complete explosion, where there wasn't a lot of gases left over, that you would have a more efficient engine, more efficient explosion, more efficient explosion put into the wheel so this thing would move. But no, of course, I think some people way up on top planned it this way, because if you have a combustion that is not complete, and then you try to modify these gases coming off, restrict them, or change them, your efficiency is going down. So you're using more fuel, which the gasoline companies, oil companies want you to use more fuel, really, because they make more money. So if you really study this, I know it's conspiracy theories and stuff like that, but if you weigh it all together, if you have a more complete explosion, it's a win-win situation. And you don't have all these leftover gases, or as many, that are deleterious to the atmosphere and to the people around. So, of course, to make matters worse, is the gasoline today is not the same gasoline that was made in the early 1960s or in the 1950s or the 1930s. It's got agents in it that cut down on the evaporation of the fuel. These are bonding agents in the molecules. Well, what happens when you add all these bonding agents to the gasoline? They stick together, the molecules stick together more, and they don't combust as well. And so they have more leftover obnoxious gases, and they're not as efficient. And you end up using more fuel. So before you had these bonding agents added to the fuel, you could get more complete combustion. And a lot of people in the early 60s and 50s and way back in the 30s and the 20s were gasifying. They were turning the liquid gas into more of a gas before it went into the combustion chamber to ignite. And of course that made, there's a gasoline motor going by right now. And so let's see, where was I? So the ignition, there was more complete combustion, more cleaner combustion when you had these gases and they were heated more. And there was other different methods that were used to get these molecules further apart so they would combust more completely. You see, that's the way you do something. And of course, the whole motivation movement, as I'm going to talk about in my first video that I'm going to label first, is going to show other methods of motivation movement. Now, according to this, I'm only 8 minutes into this, so maybe I'll give these, because I think I covered that for most of you. Basically, what I was saying is that the people that are running the show today, they may say that they're experts, but if you look at what they're doing, they're just looking at one thing, and it's not necessarily the best thing because they're not looking at the whole picture. If you can save, get more efficient combustion, get more gasoline, more bang for the buck, you're going to need less fuel. So therefore, at the end, you're going to be creating less pollution. If your automobile gets 100 miles to the gallon, it's not going to take as much gasoline and as much work to produce that gasoline because you're getting 100 miles to the gallon as opposed to 25 miles to the gallon or 20 miles to the gallon. You see? It was a few years ago, maybe it was 5, 6, 7 years ago, Honda had a contract in Taiwan to make a 50cc motorcycle. And I saw the brochure. It was going to come out the next year. And, it was one of these 2-page glossy brochures, and this thing was supposed to get 150 miles to the gallon. Of course, it was only 50cc. But the carburetor, which was a fuel injection, was as big as the whole engine, with the computer and everything. So it was way more efficient, and they were looking at the combustion of this fuel, which incidentally was the newer fuel, which is not as efficient, but still they were able to pressurize it enough and gasify the gasoline liquid enough to make it more efficient to get this 50 cc, which actually had more power than the older 50 cc's, and it would go, 55, 60 miles an hour too. And, so I waited next year and never heard anything. Anyway, another year went by or something, and I went back to try to find these brochures or any information. And I wish I'd copied the thing down, because there wasn't anything I could find on the internet that this thing was ever in existence. And I should have downloaded it, because I had a picture of it. I mean, it was a prototype model. It was a real thing. So that's just an example. It just, something happened to it. Somebody didn't want something that would get 150 miles to the gallon, produce more horsepower, be more efficient, so people could move around a lot easier. The Geo Metro, those were 3-cylinder gasoline engines, and they got, if you drove carefully, you got over 50 miles to the gallon, and they had pretty good pickup. I mean, not like a V8 or, a 6-cylinder or something. They were really efficient engines, and they were lighter. They were able to get by with all this without as much crap, so-called safety items that made the whole thing heavier. So it was a lighter vehicle, and I've had those vehicles. They're great vehicles. Anyway, to move on here, it's 12 minutes. I was going to cover something that the Vril Society in Germany, which was different than the Thule Society and different than the Nazis. These were all different groups prior to World War II, and they extend. Most of them started back in the 20s and maybe even before that. But the Germans made compartmentalization a great thing, where somebody didn't know what somebody else in another department was working on to complete this bigger picture item. And of course, under Project Paperclip, the U.S. corporations have copied this, and the CIA and the NSA. They have compartmentalization. Same with the military. So that somebody working on something doesn't know what somebody else is doing. And so these different societies and groups in Germany were doing this too. And after World War II, under Project Paperclip, the Nazis that were under the rocket program, von Braun, came to the United States along with the MK Ultra and the mind manipulation programs and the drugs and everything. They came to the United States and worked on private corporations here. And basically the CIA is a private corporation too, because it doesn't really have to okay itself with the supposed government of the United States. So anyway, the Vrils were, that's V-R-I-L, were looking at different concepts in flight and how air moved over the wing of an aeroplane. And it was determined that the coanda effect had a lot more to do with lifting an airplane than what we're taught in school about the shape of the wing, about the speed, having to go faster over the top because of the curve than underneath. Now, I'm not saying that that doesn't exist. I'm saying the coanda effect of the air moving over that surface causes a sticking. And so when that air is moved up the shape of that air, you can create more lift by the sticking by the shape of the wing. And I'm saying that that has a lot more effect that people don't even look at today. Burnelli, B-U-R-N, had in this country in the 20s and 30s, had an airplane that was mostly made of more of a wing in the fuselage, so it was a real wide body. It was like being in a movie theater, a small movie theater. It was, in a sense, the beginning of the flying wing. And supposedly he had these all developed, and I've seen pictures of them. And in the late 30s, there was almost more work put into these as complete items because they could lift more cargo. They weren't necessarily faster, but they were more efficient in lifting greater cargoes. And I heard one story that Roosevelt was going to approve all this, and we were going to build the cargo planes like that. And then he found out this Burnelli didn't support the Democratic Party. And so he nixed the whole thing, and we went into fuselages that were long and narrow with bigger wings on the outsides that weren't a part of the entire structure. So anyway, this coanda effect, you get more lift when you're using that, and there's all different proven techniques, and there's toys out there that actually uses coanda effect, but you don't see it used in lift, in airplanes today. But to take that coanda effect another step, big, gigantic step, why use air, movement of air particles? Why not use the forces of gravity, which actually operate somewhat similar, and the coanda effect could be applied via frequencies, and affecting those frequencies, tuning them to the Earth so that you get a lift from the Earth. In a sense, you're functioning within the gravitational force field via the quanta effect. So when you make this frequency right and oscillate it and resonate it the right way with the Earth, you have a lifting effect. And that's basically what these UFOs are and what functional gravity field effects are. Now, the great thing about this is there's a whole bunch of ways of accomplishing this as opposed to the combustion engine moving a vehicle. You're limited with that piston if you're using that piston. Now, you can use different forms of combustion and hooking those to the wheels to be more efficient by using less parts, but they don't want to do that. The automotive industry has this basic engine that was designed in the early 1920s, and even before that. And the only thing they've changed on is basically they no longer have a carburetor on it. They have a fuel injector, which has to be used because of the bonding agents in the fuel today stick together, and you need more pressure to push them into the combustion chamber. That's why a lot of these older motorcycles, you leave them parked. The motorcycles have smaller jets because they don't use as much. So if you leave a motorcycle parked for a few months nowadays, you won't be able to start it because the jets plug up because the fuel has more crap in it, and it sticks up and plugs that jet, and you can't start the thing because now the newer motorcycles have fuel injections and there's more pressure, and it tends to push that out. So there's another example. So there's a quick story, 20 minutes, of functional gravity. If you look at the entire thing that you're trying to do, the bigger picture of it, and say, where can I get more out of this, instead of looking at one thing and concentrating on that, you get further down the road. And that's what the German nationals, not the Nazis, were able to do. And they're just one form of the breakaway civilizations that are going on today. There's a lot of different secret groups out there sailing around in gravity, these big triangles and all sorts of other craft. There's so many being seen today because there's so many different ways of accomplishing this. So with that, I hope you gained something out of this educational video. Thank you and good day. Bye.